Hello, my name is Christian Ford Marcellos, and today I'll be going over Irish pub culture and food for my presentation. So let's dive on in. With this picture here, you're going to see a pub called the Brazen Inn, or the Brazen Head. It was Ireland's oldest pub and holds a very distinguished title. These sites have been around for a very long time and are all across the country. But to understand them a little bit better, we have to dive into the origins of the pub and how they got started. So the roots of the Irish pubs, they date back to the times of the ancient Gaelics, the clans of old, and even the Romans. The Romans come into play when they were creating their own empire in Europe. They would create these very long roads to transport goods, soldiers, and other things like that. And over time, they would create taverns about every 20 miles or so. These taverns were places of rest, of food, and of places where they could get a good drink. Interesting fact about the taverns, they would actually employ women in the taverns. Sometimes they were women who were either single or had been widowed through accident, disease, or war, and they would be able to work there to subsidize their income and played a very vital role in ale creation. And over time, the Romans took this concept of the tavern and spread it out into England. And this will come into play later because the British would travel on over to Ireland and bring that concept with them as well. Now, Ireland didn't have contact with Romans, so it was a little bit different. They already had their own system going on. There were a lot of very agricultural and rural areas in Ireland, and the country was ruled over by groups of clans and chieftains. Now, the chieftains, they were not dictators. They had their own strict rules they had to follow. One was each chieftain had to have their own brewery and someone who would run the brewery. These were called bruadines. The bruadines had to enforce the rule of warmth and hospitality for visitors. People who traveled there were always allowed to get a bed and a hot meal. They were always greeted with somebody who was a torch bearer. And these bruadines, they were open 24 hours a day. They never closed. So that's an interesting fact there. And over time, the taverns and the bruadines, that concept of this sort of place where you can stay, you could sleep, you could travel to go get a drink in various types of areas, that began to grow larger and spin into what we see today. So the roots of many Irish pubs specifically, they were rooted in the working class, though they weren't perhaps called pubs until later, until the 17th and 18th century. They were a place where the working class would go, blow off some steam, and spend their hard-earned wages on a nice tall pint or two. So one reason these buildings appealed to the working class was because unlike some fancier, higher society places to go drink, there was not a fee charged to enter. So that's why it appealed to people who weren't making that much money. They were able to afford it more. And over time throughout the 17th and 18th century, as these really expanded in popularity, we began to see the rise of the term the public house, aka the pub. That is where the name originated from. And interestingly enough, for most of their history, these pubs, they were pretty unregulated. It's surprising to find out how locally they were governed. And as British rule continued, they began to employ more taxes, more rules, more limitations, and began to really restrict the freedom of movement and the ways that these buildings operated. And then 1838 rolled around and the temperance movement, started by priests and religious individuals and encouraged by those who did not partake in alcohol, saw alcohol as a scourge of Irish society and began to try to wipe it out. And their movement really gained ground. And as a result of that, those who owned pubs had to adapt their business model. And so we saw the rise of the spirits groceries. Now, these were buildings that not only sold liquor, but they also sold common goods, sewing items, they sold medicine, they sold tools, things used to fix supplies and other items at home, and they resembled a lot of modern grocery stores that we would see today. And they did this because spirit sales declined in response to the temperance movement. But over time, even more taxes and policies were put into place that forced those who ran these type of businesses to make a choice, either spirits or goods. You are not allowed to sell both. You have to get a permit, and your permit is going to limit your opportunity and your options. This didn't make a lot of people happy, but they had to roll with the punches and try to do their best to survive and put food on the table. So, this brings us to the local. The local is a slang name in Ireland for your local watering hole, your favorite place to go get a drink. Some people may have several locals, several places that they like to frequent throughout their area, but that's the term that they call it. Now, to get to the heart of what makes a true Irish pub an Irish pub, a big part of it is the atmosphere, the vibe, the environment, the feeling there. It is warm, it is inviting, it can be high energy and rowdy at times, very personable. The bartender is going to know everybody there by name. He's going to know all his patrons' favorite drinks. And it's to the point where they say in Ireland, for a bartender to have to ask for a patron's favorite drink, it's likened to forgetting their name. That's the type of bond and understanding of each other. Very personable, very casual, very warm and inviting. And the pubs were more than just a place to go get drunk at. They served very, very important social functions. These pubs were gathering places for all different people of different status and different working classes and jobs and positions. Farmers, fishermen, repairmen, anyone who had merchants, anyone who had anything to do within their society could meet there as a common meeting ground and engage in conversation and talk about their lives and interact with each other. So the social function cannot be understated. It was one of the most important things about the Irish pub. Like I said, the atmosphere, it was very casual, and it came with some very interesting traditions. For example, you're not required to tip the bartender. The only time that you're actually required to tip or provide money beyond the payment of your drink is if food was being served. Food did not begin to actually be served within pubs until the 1970s. The concept of dining out was not very common at all in Irish culture. You would buy your goods or trade for your goods, and you would take it home and cook for your family. So that changed in fairly recent times. So you'd only tip if someone was serving your table. It's very common to have informal conversations with strangers, different than what you might see in America. They didn't put up that social boundary. They would talk to everybody. And part of this ritual would be slagging. They would throw lighthearted barbs or jokes at your expense as a way of not to insult you, but as a way of breaking the ice, creating a conversation, and kind of showing that you were being accepted into their dynamic, into their circle. Many people who visit Ireland get offended at this, but it's actually a good sign. If they're not talking to you, that's probably an issue. Now we're going to get into something, of course, you've all been waiting to hear about. Pub food, a blend of Irish and British influence due to British occupation in Ireland. A lot of Irish food is not necessarily known for mind-blowing flavor profiles. It can be very simple, home style, comforting, simple, easy to eat, and potatoes are at the staple because when they were introduced in 1590, they were super easy to grow in large quantities, only took a little bit of land and had a high yield. So a couple staples within the pub food scene would be something like shepherd's pie, 2 layers of delicious mashed potatoes with leftover scraps of meat, whatever you could find, a handful of vegetables, whatever herbs you had, in the middle in a delicious pie. Bangers and mash, that would come from Britain. Sausages made with water fillers from lack of meat during World War I became a staple as it crossed over into Ireland and became a very mainstay dish. You had things like corned beef, champ and colcannon, salted beef and mashed potatoes, all fused together into a delicious dish. And then you had things like boxty or even fish stew. Boxty being grated potatoes being baked into little pancakes, and fish stew being used off of local ingredients. So You can see where the food came from